Starting to slow down and entering the room. We can get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nathan Rake. I'm the manager of state and local affairs here at Renew Northeast, and I want to welcome you to our first webinar of 2026, Connecting Offshore Wind to the Grid, Regional Transmission Planning, Interconnection, and What It Means for Communities. For those of you who are not familiar with Renew Northeast, Renew is a nonprofit organization with over 17 years of responsible and reliable clean energy development advocacy across the 6 New England states. We are governed by the clean energy industry and leading environmental organizations. Together, we provide a single, coherent voice to achieve clean energy policy goals. This webinar is part of Renew's On the Line initiative. Together, we are working on building a community of leaders, business owners, developers, and the general public who are interested in ensuring that local voices and interests are part of the growing dialogue around development of our regional electric grid. Communities have a lot on the line, and Renew wants to share our resources and perspective and knowledge to amplify your local perspectives. You can join our mailing list to receive updates on pending policy changes, events, and other issues that are important to you by scanning the QR code. Lastly, as a piece of housekeeping, if you have questions at any time during the presentation, please use the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen. If icons do not appear, hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen. Please note that chat has been disabled for the duration of this webinar. Without further ado, it is my honor to introduce our featured speaker this afternoon, the director at Power Advisory, Peter Shattuck. Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Nathan, and welcome all on this toasty Thursday afternoon. Thank you to Renew for the invite to talk about one of my favorite topics near and dear to my heart, which is connecting offshore wind to the grid. So, next slide, please. Quick word about Power Advisory, based here in the Commonwealth, focused on electric sector, energy market analysis, strategy, procurement, policy, basically everything but engineering. We've worked, as you can see on the map there, in jurisdictions across North America, looking at issues related to offshore wind, including interconnection. And I myself been with the firm for a bit over 2 years, and before that was with a transmission developer focused on largely interconnecting offshore wind, managing projects in New England. So hence the near and dear part. Next slide, please. So that we'd start with an orientation just to the components of an offshore wind farm and interconnection to the grid. This is a nice schematic borrowed from the German-Dutch grid operator TenneT, and I'll be speaking some more about their ambitious work later on in the deck. But here what they show is an approach where you have, starting on the left, the wind turbines themselves, planted in the seabed, so this would be analogous to the water depths that are south of New England, where it's called fixed bottom offshore wind. There are additional lease areas to the east of New England in the Gulf of Maine that would be actually floating offshore wind, so the image would look a little different. But regardless of the approach, you then have medium voltage, what are called inter-array cables that come from the offshore wind turbines, can connect multiple turbines on one of those cables that would go to a collector station that then increases the voltage and allows shipping the power longer distances to shore, where it then makes a cable landing, goes to an onshore substation, and then connects to the grid, and from there on supplies consumers with electricity. This example shows an alternating current system. There are two ways to connect power to the grid. There's high voltage alternating current, HVAC, and then high voltage direct current, HVDC. The initial projects that are closer to shore are typically AC. and then as you go further distances are DC, but I'll elaborate on that a bit more. So next slide, please. So when I thought about how to walk through this issue, I figured I'd start with the kind of bottom up, looking at an offshore wind developer's perspective, or entity that's looking to connect an offshore wind farm to the grid. And that really consists of a few steps that happen to some degree in parallel, but I've got them lined up. Here is first identifying where on the grid the wind would connect, the cables would connect. And that involves first looking at what can the grid accommodate. So what's the grid hosting capacity at a point of interconnection? And then looking at the ease of access to get to that point of interconnection, which would typically be an onshore substation. And then what's the distance to that point of interconnection from the offshore wind farm? And here's where the use of technology comes in. High voltage alternating current systems are typically cheaper for shorter distances because the grid operates at alternating current. And you can ship the power to shore from approximately 60 miles. But once you exceed that limit, the losses through resistance and heat on the cables erode the economics of high voltage alternating current, and then you move on to HVDC. Now, HVDC has higher costs because you have to convert the electricity from AC to DC offshore and then again onshore, and those converter stations are expensive. But at a certain point, approximately 60 miles, it offsets the additional cost, and also HVDC allows for routing longer distances, so it opens up greater possibilities for the point of interconnection and routing offshore and onshore. So next slide. So skipped over the last piece there, but once a developer has figured out the point of interconnection where they want to inject the power, then they file what's called an interconnection request. And little context here is important. 20, 30 years ago, when the grid was planned around a limited number of large central stations, there were maybe a dozen of these interconnection requests in that ballpark coming in New England every year. So it was relatively straightforward to study what would be required to connect those new projects to the grid, to identify necessary upgrades. But now, as we've moved to a system and particularly focus on developing new resources that are much more numerous, so hundreds of wind, solar, energy storage projects, it's caused a rethink of the grid interconnection process. So whereas historically it was a first come, first served, first ready, first served process, it's now a cluster system where the grid operator, ISO New England, will take all the interconnection requests that pool together and meet certain eligibility requirements, and then study them all at once. So the goal here was to speed up the interconnection process. In part, that's achieved by requiring developers to put down pretty significant deposits, and that can help head off the historical practice of developers, when they didn't have to put down a lot of money, maybe putting in 4 or 5 interconnection requests for the same project, and then those all had to be studied, slowed things down. So the hope is that this expedites the process. Still going to take a while because it's complicated. I won't walk through this chart at the bottom here, but just note that what it shows is the different phases of the process, and then down at the bottom, the different readiness deposits. So basically, as you go further through the system, they want to make sure that you've got more skin in the game and are less likely to pull out and have to redo the whole thing. Nonetheless, it can still take almost 2 years. That's the objective. We're just launching this process right now. So next slide, please. All right, so that was the bottom-up look at what a developer might be, how they might be approaching this. So then shifting to the other side, the top-down approach. The grid operator, ISO New England, has the role of ensuring that the transmission system can accommodate load and meet growing demands over time. And what they've started to do more recently at the request of the New England states is, in addition to just planning around what's the demand going to be and what are the resources on the system, to start looking at the long-term goals that states have, particularly around decarbonization. And the first product of this new approach was something called the 2050 Transmission Study, to identify what sort of new transmission and transmission upgrades would be required to achieve the state's goals while meeting all the other standards for reliable and safe operation of the grid. And the study found 4 what they called high likelihood concerns. So these were areas of the grid that would require attention regardless of the nuances of assumptions about which type of resources were most likely to occur. And of these 4 areas, one of them was the need to increase the ability to bring power down from Maine to southern New England. There's a lot of onshore wind and solar in Maine, and even more potential for further development. So increasing the ability to bring that power down to where the majority of the demand is the focus of the first procurement competitive solicitation for transmission under this longer term transmission planning process. So that RFP is underway, was issued last year, and they're currently evaluating proposals. Another very interesting piece of this long-term study, particularly for us offshore wind transmission nerds, was the possibility that ISO New England put forward that one of these additional high likelihood concerns, namely the need to deliver additional power to the Boston area, and this is because of growing demand, but also electrification of transportation and heat pumps, that load could potentially be supplied by connecting offshore wind farms directly to the Boston area. And then in addition to that, connecting other wind farms to southeast New England, where a lot of them are currently focused on connecting. And then making connections between the wind farms offshore. And that would have a couple of objectives there, benefits there. You could route power where it's needed, when it's needed, over these essentially effective kind of offshore connections between southeast New England and wind farms and then the Boston area. But also, when the wind isn't blowing, ability to use those cables to route power, again, from southeast New England via offshore to Boston, because what's happening is the reason attention was needed in the Boston area is the onshore transmission starts to reach its capacity. So an interesting concept about how you create kind of a dual purpose use of this offshore energy infrastructure. Next slide. So other states, namely New York, New Jersey to the south, have taken a step beyond just planning and have actually started to proactively develop transmission for offshore wind. New York has had 2 initiatives. They call a public policy transmission planning process, where every 2 years they evaluate needs that are driven by the state's public policy. And important to note here that New York has a single grid, meaning as one grid operator just for New York. So kind of easy to match up those goals for just one state. And what they found in the process a couple years ago was that the offshore wind that was proposed to land on Long Island was going to pretty quickly overwhelm the capacity of the grid on Long Island to accept all that power. And so what they did is they ran a procurement for transmission that would enable the delivery of 3,000 megawatts of offshore wind onto Long Island, and then flowing that power up through New York City and to the rest of the state. They chose a developer, a consortium, that's the public power entity, New York Power Authority, and a consortium of the utilities there to develop this project, which you see, if you squint at that map there, that's kind of Long Island into New York, a number of different underground cables, and then crossing over the Long Island Sound into the New York City area. Following that, because New York then increased its offshore wind goals, in 2024 they initiated a kind of even more ambitious offshore wind transmission solicitation called the New York City PPTN. Now, this would involve not just upgrading the onshore grid to receive offshore wind, but actually running cables out into the water so that offshore wind farms could connect directly offshore and then flow power into the New York City load pocket, because essentially Long Island is full, even with these upgrades that were in the Propel project. And it's tricky to get multiple cables into New York Harbor. So the thinking was, we've got a scarce kind of resource in cable routes. It's tricky to do multiple projects in New York City. Let's do this all at once and prepare the grid and create a kind of ready-made interconnection point offshore. That initiative was then paused when federal permitting and approvals of offshore wind was paused, but it stands as kind of an example on the progression of thinking about how to connect offshore wind. In New Jersey, they did something that looked probably a little bit more analogous to the Propel, the upgrades on Long Island, but they were the first to go and did a solicitation in conjunction with their grid operator, which is PJM, to conduct what they call a state agreement approach. And they put out a broad appeal to developers to just come up with concepts to help them figure out how to achieve their offshore wind goals. And that could consist of running cables all the way out into the ocean, or just upgrading the onshore grid, or running connections to shore. And they ended up selecting a project, or actually combining a couple projects that involved upgrading a substation to create kind of onshore wind receiving hub, and then upgrading the grid to enable that hub to receive multiple gigawatts or the output from multiple offshore wind farms. So next slide, we'll take a little, not quite yet. So then there's the even more ambitious approach would be to think about creating a much bigger offshore grid for offshore wind. So this would be a step towards thinking about really building out the grid proactively to integrate multiple wind farms. So instead of having each wind developer run their own cable to shore, the ability to rationalize the system and do kind of pre-build. So this would be akin to what New York was thinking, but broader, where potentially this could be an initiative for the entire Atlantic coast. And this concept was evaluated by the Department of Energy in what they called their Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study, which looked at increasing levels of integration of offshore wind transmission. So this image here, which is a little small, but at the right, and you got to reorient yourself, it's looking there at the Atlantic coast, looks at 3 different variants of increasing levels of connectivity offshore. So starting on the left, the first one is an intra-regional approach. You can see New England there at the top with the pink lines. So this is, I think it's somewhat akin to what ISO New England said, where you'd have wind farms offshore, connection to the Boston area, and now there they've got one down into southwest Connecticut. But that would enable flowing power between those regions onshore, and also routing offshore wind where it's most needed, where prices are highest at the moment. And then going to the south, connections within just New York or within just New Jersey, and then further south, those wind farms off of Virginia and North Carolina. The middle image shows what it would look like to do inter-regional, so where you'd start connecting these different regions. And that's important because New England has one grid that operates largely independently, New York, and then the Mid-Atlantic has the PJM. And the connections between these grid regions is somewhat limited. So this would allow basically creating an alternate route offshore to flow power between the regions. And then the most ambitious, when we move all the way to the right, is what they're calling a backbone concept. And that could involve potentially connecting multiple of these wind farms and cables to shore all the way, as they're showing, from Maine down to South Carolina. Now, this was illustrative. No one's planning this right away. And having followed this and been involved in conversations thinking about these types of approaches, the evolution is probably to think, where are the opportunistic connections? If we're already building connections from, let's say, and this is underway, a wind farm that's going from the New England, at least area south of New England, to Long Island, and you've got another one that's going to Cape Cod, and they're only 30, 40 miles apart. Can't interconnect those now because that wasn't planned ahead of time. But going forward, could there be the possibility of installing some degree of forward-looking infrastructure into this offshore wind transmission that would allow opportunistic connections in the future? So, run through. We're next going to do a kind of whistle-stop tour to other jurisdictions to look at how they're thinking about things. But I see Nathan put a note in the chat. But maybe I'll just pause and see if there are any questions that folks want to insert at this point.
If anyone in attendance has any questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A, and we'll be happy to address them. All right, Peter, I think you
Got it all covered.
I know. Everyone's an expert on offshore wind transmission.
Excellent. All right. Well, I had to sneak in a glass of water, a sip of water anyhow. And I know it's just going to take one, and then the floodgates will open, so someone will be that brave soul. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. So moving first to the north, there's a significant interest in developing offshore wind in Atlantic Canada. They have a great wind resource. It's both offshore and onshore. And they're in the process of licensing or leasing, in the terms we use here, the areas that could host up to 5 gigawatts of capacity. But other analyses show that there are hundreds of gigawatts of potential in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and particularly when you get up to Newfoundland and Labrador. But a challenge there is there's not a lot of demand. It's a relatively small population. Their peak demand on their system is about 2.5 gigawatts. And maybe for context, the biggest power plant in New England is Millstone Nuclear Substation in Connecticut. It's about 2 gigawatts of capacity. The entire New England system peaks around 30,000, a little more than 30,000 gigawatts. So much smaller system up there. And so what's needed is transmission to export to other markets. This is where they're considering what they're calling the Wind West Initiative. So the Premier of Nova Scotia, and working with counterparts in other jurisdictions and with their federal government, the Major Projects Office, is looking to get support, because this would be a major infrastructure build out. That's probably more than would be put on the back of any one wind developer, to build export capacity to Quebec, which is quite a large system, kind of on the scale electrically in terms of size with New England, and potentially even further on to Ontario, where the industrial load has a greater demand. But over time, there is a possibility, and it would be another logical export market, to bring power down to New England. Importantly, the first step of this is underway, in that Hydro-Quebec, the grid operator that owns all the facilities in Quebec, has issued a request for information from offshore wind and transmission developers for concepts to enable that export, looking at onshore routes, offshore routes, to bring that power to Quebec. And then over time, as the industry ramps up, could involve additional exports to New England. And importantly, earlier this year, Massachusetts and Nova Scotia enacted or joined together in a memorandum of understanding to increase collaboration around multiple elements of offshore wind supply chain, kind of best practices, but also looking at transmission. So as we think about the region's needs and New England's needs, and the fact that offshore wind is a little bit of uncertainty around that now, possibility that this could play an important role as part of a portfolio of resources to meet New England's needs. So, Nathan, I see you had a question teed up.
Yes. So this was a question that came in ahead of today. So we're talking a lot about, and I think this is a good time to have this conversation. At what point in the interconnection process do communities and municipal officials actually have a window to weigh in, given that the early steps, identifying POIs, routing analysis, filing the request, sit largely with developers and ISO New England?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as you see from what I went through, it starts as a pretty technical process and it takes a long time. So I think what can happen is by the time a community becomes aware that there's a proposal to bring a transmission line for offshore wind to that community, it's often well along in the process. So I don't have a great answer in terms of exactly when in the process, but I think what we'll get to, and then maybe we can kind of come back to it later on if there are any best practices that we can learn from other jurisdictions, is that what you want to avoid is having situations where there's significant blowback that starts to make it difficult to develop projects. I think particularly if you start to have multiple projects coming into the same community over time. That is a challenge that they faced in the UK, and they took a more kind of holistic planning approach. So let me keep that in the back of my mind, and maybe we can come back to that after we look at a few of these other examples.
We do have one other question that it looks like it would be timely given where we're at. A participant asked, is the long-term goal of the backbone or shorter intra or interconnected plans to allow the ISOs to facilitate PPAs to offshore wind sites that may be outside of their traditional territory? For instance, Cape Cod Turbines PPA agreement to NISO for 10%.
Yeah, that is a possibility. There are, to some extent, we're already seeing that jurisdictions can reach beyond what you might consider their waters, although state jurisdictional waters only extend 3 miles offshore. So then you're out in federal waters. But because of those efficiencies over longer distances that high voltage direct current enables, it starts to allow for shipping power longer distances. So there actually are a couple of wind farms that are connecting to Long Island that are actually situated south of New England. So there's the South Fork Wind Farm that's kind of south of Block Island that goes over to the South Fork of Long Island, and then Sunrise Wind, which goes from the least area south of Mass and Rhode Island a little further over to the west on Long Island. So the technology allows it. I think the question is a very interesting one around, if you built a larger ocean grid, does that just increase the opportunities for states or other buyers even, some municipal utilities or maybe even corporate buyers to think about purchasing offshore wind? And that is something that's happened in Europe, where once the grid is built out to offshore, and we'll get to some examples of this, you start to have some large corporate buyers that take some of the power from these wind farms. There are also analogies onshore. So there's an example that's oft cited where Texas proactively built out transmission from the eastern and central part of the state to the Panhandle and West Texas, where a lot of the wind potential was. And then they started to see a lot of purchases by either corporate entities or even kind of green certificates. And so now Texas, even though they don't have any explicit renewable energy goals has more onshore wind in their state than any other state in the United States by leaps and bounds. So the idea of proactive infrastructure development to enable scaling is something that's been out there in different variants, and so that whether or when that's applied to offshore wind, I think is an open question. I'll say on the other side, just the realities of the moment that we're in right now, with offshore wind having slowed down, to put it mildly. These approaches to proactively develop transmission for offshore wind do involve a fair bit of complexity, and they also create what offshore wind developers can have some concern about, which is a dependency on a different entity to build their connection to shore. So if they're ready on time, if their wind farm's ready to go, and that offshore cable or even those onshore upgrades aren't ready, that can seriously erode the economics. So I think we are in a moment where we can learn from what all these other jurisdictions are doing and start to think ahead, particularly now that we have in many of these states ambitious offshore wind goals. But I would anticipate that when the industry picks back up, and I believe that it will, we might first start to see and want to see, to really gain confidence back, wind farms kind of developing their own connections to shore. Now that doesn't need to be to the exclusion of good planning, and this kind of relates to the question about when municipalities might have a say, and how onshore points of interconnection could be identified that might make sense over the long term. And there's an example of this actually in a proposal that the New England states put forward to upgrade a decommissioned coal plant, or a coal plant's gone, but to upgrade the substation that used to serve a decommissioned coal plant in Brayton Point in Somerset, Massachusetts, to receive offshore wind, and a similar proposal for a new substation in southeast Connecticut. And to some extent, I think the logic was, let's try to rationalize this. If we're going to land this stuff, let's do it at scale. Let's get it at places like a coastal coal plant that already has the infrastructure and you can get to straight from the water. So I think they're examples, and the promise of building a kind of much more integrated at scale offshore grid is there and is something that should be worked towards. But as we've seen in multiple markets, it is to some extent a kind of incremental process.
Great. We have one more question, but I think it might be best to leave this one until we move through a couple of the other examples.
Okay, well, let's go there. Where are we going next? All right. Germany, Denmark, another map that folks might not have seen, kind of this type of orientation. But what we're looking at here is a map of the North Sea. So this is Germany, DE, and the Netherlands, and a program that the Dutch-German transmission system operator TenneT, which oddly does have a capital T at the end, is doing to standardize and build at scale offshore to onshore transmission systems. So this is somewhat analogous to what New York State was proposing, the New York ISO, and that New York City PPTN. But here it's even at a bigger scale. So they're looking at doing 14 2 gigawatt, or that's 2,000 megawatts. So again, that's each of those is the equivalent to the capacity of the nuclear plant in Connecticut. 14 of these systems that would be installed out in the water, proximate to lease areas where wind farms will be developed. And then you would have the wind farm interarray cables connecting to these offshore collector and converter platforms, because they're taking that power, converting it to HVDC, and bringing it to a limited number of points on the onshore grid. So when you look, you squint, and that's about as big as I could make that figure with it. You can still get some text on the slide. There are 14 little pink circles offshore, but they're not 14 landing points onshore. So it's an opportunity to cut down on the number of cable routes and the number of landing points. Again, I don't think you're ever going to get all of the offshore wind into one point because the grid is just not designed to handle, in this case, 28 gigawatts of offshore wind at any one location. And frankly, from a reliability standpoint, you wouldn't want that because that creates a massive single point of failure. But it does create an opportunity to rationalize cable routing, to build at scale, and to figure out where it makes most sense to connect to the onshore grid. From a kind of nuts and bolts perspective, it also helps to standardize when each of these systems has to be designed. That's a lot of engineering hours and time. There's already a big crunch on the supply chain. There are really only a handful of companies that make this equipment. So putting out one standardized design and saying repeat this 14 times creates some efficiencies in a scale. So it's a great model. One of the issues is there's not really an analogous entity. So these transmission system not analogous entity in the United States yet, at least. Their transmission system operator in Germany and the Netherlands here, TenneT, they both do the planning and the building. So here we have grid operator ISO New England, and then we have utilities, and we have independent developer, transmission developers, and we have wind farm developers. So one of the challenges that in achieving kind of this scale and this vision is figuring out how do we come to some understanding on what standards make sense. There's some budding initiatives that industry and states and consultants have been involved in to think about how to adapt some of these standards. Rules are not the same. Even on the technical front, we can't at present use this biggest state-of-the-art system in the Northeast US, but there still are potentially opportunities to replicate some elements of this approach and then also do what I mentioned earlier, that kind of proactive investment in the ability to connect these things offshore. You could think about it almost like you're running a big power strip offshore and you put in one extra socket so that you can then connect the two power strips. I apologize to all the engineers on the line, but that's about as good as I can do on simplifying that one. So, interesting example. Let's move on to the next one here. So here in the UK, they took arguably an even more ambitious approach. So they had a real significant build out in the teens and kind of into the early 2020s, where great offshore wind resource, country with a lot of coastline. They were building wind farms with each cable connecting to shore, and that was starting to create some concerns about routing into communities multiple times, land use, just practical impacts of construction. And so they said, well, let's take a look and see, is there a way we can do this to achieve our goals and plan ahead for the ultimate offshore wind deployment, looking at where the wind areas are located, so these blue areas offshore, and then where on the grid could you receive this, what's the hosting capacity, and taking account routing considerations, scaling up the infrastructure, so using bigger cables, bigger systems to connect multiple wind farms. And they determined that under what they called their integrated approach, they could significantly cut down on the number of cables, the number of cable landings, and rationalize the overall approach. So you can kind of see it just in the number of lines on the map here. And then I'll call out one other piece, which is quite interesting. If you look down in the bottom right of the integrated approach, there's this funny looking kind of staple looking thing sitting in the water, which is an HVDC switching station and part of what they call a multi-purpose interconnector. So that is a cable that would run from the UK to a different country in mainland Europe, and there are a number of these operating the interconnectors themselves. So that's just a cable between the UK and France, the UK and the Netherlands. But what these multi-purpose interconnectors would do is both create the connection between markets and also allow for interconnecting offshore wind at the midpoint. So again, it's somewhat akin to what the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study was looking at, or New England's plan to think about meeting Boston load by running cables up to the Boston area and also connecting to other areas. But instead of saying we're going to retroactively take two wind farm systems that are out there and then connect them offshore, you actually just build the infrastructure first, create the receiving point there in the middle, and then connect the wind farm there. So another example, probably one of the more holistic examples of planning for integration of offshore wind. So I think that's the last one. Indeed it is.
Thank you so much, Peter. We do have a couple more questions that have come in. So, given the examples that you mentioned, including the proactive development in Texas, what might be needed policy or finance wise to support offshore?
I'll start by just focusing on New England. I think that's what we're doing here. Some of these pieces are falling into place nicely. So that 2050 transmission study is high level, incredibly complex process to plan the entire grid, and ISO New England did a Herculean effort to figure this out. I mean, this is looking towards a future 25 years down the road where we're largely decarbonized, demand is much higher, but they did it at a higher level. So what's needed is, over time, to kind of refine this analysis and say, all right, we have some ideas. I mean, even that UK figure, that wasn't their ultimate planning document. That was, here's why we should be doing this, and then you gotta get down into the details and figure out, which projects are prioritized, when do you use them, landing points, which offshore wind areas are going to be developed first. And as I noted, the New England states took some steps in this direction by identifying these two locations onshore, so the Brayton Point in Somerset and this Hunts Brook location in Connecticut, that could receive offshore wind farms, or could receive the output from offshore wind farms. So that would be kind of step number one. Let's identify where these onshore receiving points are located. To go bigger then towards the goals that the states already have, 10 plus gigawatts, or even bigger over time, analyses showing we might need up to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind in New England. It requires kind of further optimizing and prioritizing which points of interconnections get used when. That was a follow-on piece of the 2050 study. I just showed the high level. There was a screening of locations up and down the coast of New England, from Maine to Connecticut to the New York border, that identified a good number of locations, either where power plants had been replaced, where substations were relatively close to the coast or accessible from the coast, and importantly, where you would cut down on the need to then build additional onshore transmission. So a good way of illustrating this is, if you could get power into the Boston area, there's enough demand that could be soaked up. It might require some local upgrades. Whereas if a lot of offshore wind was connected at the tip of Cape Cod or up in far northern Maine, then you're going to have to upgrade the system to enable that power to flow all the way to where the customers are. So some of it is analytical, some of it is political. The fact that the states have come together and are running this first public policy transmission procurement, this longer-term transmission process for onshore wind from Maine, is kind of a first test of that mechanism that's never been done before. So I would think if that works out well, then you could think, all right, well, now what do we need to do for offshore wind and to meet other needs? And then there's this standardization piece. Ideally, if you want to create this stepwise approach towards, let's build cables offshore, but let's build them in a way that we could in the future connect them offshore. that would be a next step, and those efforts are all underway. So the good news is a lot of this is happening, and in some ways taking advantage of this lull in active offshore wind development enables pushing this ahead. But of course it also creates uncertainty, right? Because when do you then actually start to build this stuff, let alone take the steps back and say we're going to go and procure it? New York was there, they had a procurement out, they had bids in, and they said, time out. If we don't know if this is going to get restarted in 3 years or 7 years, we can't ask our ratepayers to pay for this now. So kind of a long-winded, multi-stop, hopefully answer to that question. Bigger picture, if we're getting to a full backbone, maybe there's a role for the Department of Energy or some bigger entity to come in on planning. The Department of Energy was looking to at least provide some funding for this. That was one of the things that was motivating these offshore wind hubs in Connecticut and Massachusetts, was the availability of federal funds. So money always helps, but it really requires a lot of collaboration between states, between grid operators, and I think as offshore wind picks back up, we've now got the benefit of learnings both from the region here, from other regions in the U.S., and then also models from other jurisdictions.
Turning to the European approach, how have the various European countries that you highlighted today, how have they dealt with liability risk, specifically the difficulty of assigning financial fault for cascading power outages and associated revenue losses, as well as maintenance disputes between competing developers?
Good question. I think what's lurking behind this is that the greatest risk, or you can look at it differently, the biggest source of insurance claims around offshore wind and financial losses is because export cables fail. And that can be due to a number of factors. It can be as someone drops an anchor and drags it across a cable and it breaks. The cable gets exposed and is moved by ocean currents and rubs up against rocks and is damaged. So when that happens, the whole wind farm is out. It's one thing if a wind turbine isn't working, you've got the other ones working. But once the cable goes out, then the whole wind farm goes out in a circumstance where there's no other way to get the power to shore. So if there are redundancies or other routes to get cables to shore, to get power to shore, then that mitigates that risk somewhat. This TenneT 2 gigawatt program, these are, to get a little technical, in dangerous territory as a non-engineer, but they're basically two cables that go out. And if one of them is lost, the other one can still operate. And given that the wind farms are typically not all producing 100% all the time, you still have the ability to ship a lot of that power to shore. That said, anytime there's risk, that can increase the challenges of financing projects. So in Europe, at least in the TenneT example, the transmission system operator is on the hook for losses. That did happen early on, about 20 years ago when they were first doing this, and TenneT was building the first cables out there. They weren't ready on time, and so there were a few months, I believe, might even stretch to a year, where there were losses for the wind farm, which was ready to go, and so transmission system operator had to compensate for them there. I think this is an open question as to how that would work in the U.S. in this market. It's worth noting that for the onshore grid, the transmission provider is typically not required to compensate a generator if the transmission system is down. Now, the offshore environment, is different, and if the entities are putting in a lot of effort to build these systems, you want them to be reliable, but also kind of dependable from a financing standpoint. So I think there's likely to be a need to explore this specific issue some more. And do you have compensation coming from the entity that's developing the transmission? If that's uncapped, then it becomes impossible to finance the transmission project. So at the end of the day, it might need to be ratepayers that are buying this. In some ways, this is already happening. When projects fall behind or are not completed, ratepayers aren't getting their benefit. But there could also be a direct compensation to some extent if that's what's required to get the projects financed. It's ultimately going to be a trade-off. Do you put some of that risk back on ratepayers in order to realize the long-term benefits of scaling the industry? Or do you stick, for the near term with the approach of a wind farm developer doing it all, in which case then they have to manage all that risk on their own?
Fantastic. Thanks, Peter. We have one last question. I think this is a really good one to end on for today. When you consider the past 15, 20 years of transmission development between New England and Canada, what do you consider the realistic likelihood of running a transmission from Canadian offshore wind into New England?
Yeah, I think this is an energy system observer, astute question that brings in a whole other set of considerations. If folks have been looking in the paper, when it was cold earlier or even just recently, the piece in Commonwealth magazine, the historical imports that we've gotten from Quebec, and I'm going to make an important distinction. Quebec is largely a hydroelectric driven system. They built a lot of dams multiple decades ago, and therefore were able to meet their own needs and also have power to export. And so we've had a number of connections for a long time. We just built another one called the New England Clean Energy Connect that's bringing power down from Quebec. What's changed is the factors that are causing electricity demand to increase in multiple areas of the country. This would just be economic growth, electrification, but also data centers and other energy-intensive industries. We haven't seen that as much in New England, but they're seeing it in Quebec because power is very cheap there. It's caused them to see more load growth, and then at the same time, there's a multi-year drought in place that's reduced the ability to store as much water behind the reservoirs and to be generating around the clock as much. So there have been some questions around, how reliable is that power source from Quebec? I'm going to set that all aside. What would be fundamentally different in the context of transmission from Atlantic Canada is because it's such a small system there, if you're building wind for export, it's only for export. It's not going to be for domestic needs in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick or Prince Edward Island. They just don't have enough demand there. So you would get kind of a dedicated resource that when that wind is blowing, if it's being routed by cable to New England, then you're getting it. Now, of course, the wind doesn't always blow, but that's the case with wind everywhere. We're doing a good initiative to get wind down from northern Maine. I mentioned that initiative currently underway. It's a similar, if even better, resource in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada, where it just happens to be windier. So that's kind of one important distinction, is this would be a pure kind of dedicated Atlantic Canada export, New England import. And then there's just, isn't that a long ways, right? Like, you're going to run a cable all the way up from New England to Atlantic Canada? Yes and no. It is a fair distance, but we're right now looking to build lines onshore all the way up to northern Maine. And in Europe, when you look at some of those lines on the map, for the UK or TenneT, and those aren't even the longest ones, this stuff's happening around the world. So there are systems that go from Scotland to Norway. There's a project that's going to go across the Mediterranean. There's another project that's even proposed to bring 10 gigawatts of wind and solar from Morocco all the way up to the UK. It's so big they build their own cable factory. Now, whether or not that project comes about, I think it just shows that the rest of the world, is getting to scale on some of these resources, and some of that's because they don't have as much of their own domestic supply. We have gas, we have coal that's going out. So I think we've become a little more parochial, dare I say the word, in New England about thinking about what's possible. And I would argue that this idea of Nova Scotia or Atlantic Canada to New England is something that's entirely feasible. It's not going to be putting all the eggs in that basket, but it is a diversification strategy, I think, particularly at this moment in time, as we see that there's an element of just policy and political diversification that could have some benefit. So let me stop there.
Peter, that's a fantastic one, and I would be remiss if I actually lost out on this last question that came in right at the gun. And I think this ties it in really nicely to when we're talking about communities. We've heard a lot about what ISO New England is doing and what the states are doing, but how can the private side support these these goals and these plans? What can advocates do? What can municipalities do? And what can the general public do?
Well, I'll turn it right back. I say, keep attending these webinars, these great webinars that Renew is putting on, and just get informed. The lineup that Nathan provided earlier looks great. I think education is key. Going back to the first question that came in, you have to know what the process is and kind of where you might want to see it come out in order to be able to engage effectively and in a timely manner. And I think once people have that information, then you go to policymakers and elected officials and kind of make the case, look at what they're doing elsewhere, and here's where we're seeing some models or ways that we might want things to go. Because otherwise, this stuff just goes along until there's a problem. So I think education and engagement are the ways to get ahead of this.
Fantastic. Well, Peter, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you everyone for joining us. We have a great lineup of events coming up through the rest of the month, as well as looking ahead to the year ahead. Next Monday, we'll be joined with our friends from ACOR to have a conversation on the case for transmission and renewables in New England. Next Tuesday, if you want to take a deeper dive into the recently promulgated siting and permitting regulations and what that means for your community, Renew will be hosting a hybrid event at the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce. And then looking towards the late summer and the fall, we look forward to having a three-part including on onshore wind, offshore wind, and a myth busting, as well as joining some of our other friends and colleagues in the region to discuss electromagnetic fields and their impacts on fisheries. If any of these upcoming events sound interesting to you, please be on the lookout for registration in the coming days and weeks. Thank you so much for everyone for attending. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to my email on the screen or scan the QR code to join our mailing list to receive timely updates about events like these. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today, and have a great rest of your day.